Today's daf in Masechet Bava Metzia is daf Yud Aleph 11, and we are at the Mishnah, which is a very direct continuation of everything we've been talking about. So the Mishnah, well, let me say it this way: the previous discussion, right, has been talking about how a person can acquire an object, and one of the cases we talked about yesterday was, well, the main case was whether arba amot of a person, whether you jump on something. The Mishnah said you're not koneh, but maybe your space is koneh. And obviously, we talked yesterday about this question about whether a chatzer, when the Torah clearly says by a get that you, well, the Mishnah derives from the pasuk by a get that you can give a woman a get in her chatzer, not just in her personal hands. Well, the question was whether that's because a chatzer represents her messenger, a chatzer represents her hand. Today we get into the continuation of that discussion with the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph, which says the following: Ra'a ech otan ratzin achar Metzia. Right, you see a bunch of people running after a Metzia. Now, presumably, the Metzia in this case is a movable thing, right? They're not running after a diamond ring that's running away. So there's an animal, right? And this is probably the most common thing that people would find. You would find an animal that doesn't belong to anybody, right? A chicken that is wild somehow, and everyone wants this chicken. Whoever gets it is going to have a good meal. And everyone's running after this chicken. Obviously, seeing it does not give you a possession. Or let's say achar tzvi shavor, after a deer which has a broken leg, because we're going to see in a second if the deer doesn't have a broken leg, it's a lot harder to catch, right? So there's a deer that has a broken leg, something like that, or gozlot shelo percho, or let's say it's birds that don't know how to fly yet, right? So they're hopping around, they're little chicks, right? So that's something that's reasonable to capture. Obviously, a bird that's going to fly, it's very, very hard to capture a bird. The amar, now, of course, they're chasing this thing, and they're running through your front yard. And you say, Zachtali Sadi. I'm standing there looking through my window. 5 people are running after this chicken running through my yard. I want my yard to be kona this thing, right? So I want to use it through a kinyan of my chatzer. Zachtalo. Says the Mishnah, it's yours, which is very disappointing for everyone else, but it's yours. Hayat Tzvi Ratz Kedarko. Now, let's say the deer is running normally. So obviously you can't capture it in your field, assuming your field doesn't have fences, right? You can't capture it in your yard. Oshaya goes, look, mafrichin, these are birds that are flying away or able to fly away. V'amar Zachtali Sadi, but it's in your field for a minute. And you say, I want it, I zocher in my field, and then someone else goes and captures it. Lo amar klum, what you said is nothing, because since, we'll see in the Gemara, but since when it's in your field, you could not have sort of owned it without much more effort, the saying zacha is not enough. Okay? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Says the Gemara, there's a very important detail here. And that says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel is v'hu she'omed b'tzad sadeo. You have to be standing next to your field, meaning you have to be at your field in order for your field to be kona this lost object. Ask the Gemara why. Why do you have to be there? The tikni le sadeo. Why can't your field be acquired even if you're not there? Meaning, let's say you're in Shul and you hear, oh, in your backyard, let's say you have a big backyard, right? There's a deer running around that's broken leg. Everyone's trying to chase it. And you're like, well, it's my yard. I want it, right? That's not enough. Why not? Why won't you say that your sadeh is koneh? Damar Rabbi Yossi bar B'chanina, chatzero shel adam koneh lo shelo midato, that a person's chatzer can actually be koneh without you even knowing about it. So you can't say that you have to be there in order to apply your knowledge. You can be koneh in your chatzer even if you don't know. Answers the Gemara, well, it depends. Hani mili, when Rabbi Yossi bar B'chanina said that your chatzer can be koneh without your knowledge, that's b'chatzer hamishtameret. That's a chatzer that has walls around it, that's protected, that's watched. So that something that goes into that chatzer is not going to easily leave that chatzer, and it's therefore yours. Avon, the case in the Mishnah is talking, about a chatzer she'eno mishtameret. This chatzer is not, mishtamer here literally means watch, but it means, protected, right? There's no walls around the chatzer, right? Or they're unsecured. And therefore, says, that's where Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel said, I omeid, b'tzad sadeo in, if you're standing next to the field, and therefore you're able to give it shmirah, right? So this animal is running around in your field, you're standing there, you're saying, I'm going to keep it in there, and it's my field, then you're kona. But but if you're not there to prevent it from leaving, then you're not kona and thing that's in your field just because it's in your property. The Tanya, as we learned in a very interesting case of shikha. And that's not the rest of the daf, but half the daf today is going to talk about the case of shikha. Remember that shikha, by definition, the word shikha means you forgot, right? And so Torah says, if you're harvesting your field and you forget to pick up certain stuff, remember, this is separate from peah and leket, right? Things that you leave for aniyim. Shikha is what you forgot. You did not intend to leave it. You unintentionally gave charity, right? And the pasuk says, whatever you forget, you should leave behind, right? Don't go back and get it. So what does forgetting mean? Meaning, when do you define forgetting? So says the Braita, let's try to quantify this. Titania. Haya omed be'ir. Person is standing in the city. Remember, the fields used to be outside the city, right? So you're back in your home. You're back in a cafe having a cup of coffee. The omer, and you say, oh my gosh, Yodea anisha omer sheyesh li b'sadeh pa'alim shakichu. I realized that I prepared a bundle of sheaves, right, an omer, and I forgot, I didn't tell the workers to look behind that tree, and I know that the workers are going to forget it, right? You hire people to collect your bundles, and you know that they're going to forget it. And you say, lo yehei shikha. That should not be considered shikha. I want to go back and get that. Even though I know my workers are going to forget it because it's in a hard to find place, I actually intentionally think about it and it shouldn't be shikha. Says the Braita, yachol lo yehei shikha. You might think that that counts, and it is not shikha, that by you saying, I didn't forget that thing over there, you didn't forget it. Talmud lomar v'shachachta omer basadeh, right? It's where you forgot something in the field, meaning bisadeh v'shachachta. You have to be in the field and forget it. That's considered to be, we'll see, the Gemara is going to analyze all these words in a second. That's considered to be shikha, v'lo be'ir, not if you're in the city. This is where you just said contradictory things. Hagufa kasha. Your Braita didn't add up. Amrit, first you said, Yachol lo yehei shikha. That you might think that that is not shikha because you said in the city, I didn't forget that. We said you might think that's true, but it's not true. So Amma, you see from the first part of the Braita, Havi leis shikha, that the fact that you remembered and said, I intentionally want this bundle of grain, but you're not in the field means that it doesn't count. Since you're not there, it doesn't matter. So the fact that you said, I want this, doesn't matter. So it is shikha. But then this pasuk said, "V'nasiv Gemara," and then you bring a drasha from the pasuk that says, "Bisadeh v'shachachta." It's where you forget it while you're in the field, v'lo be'ir, but not if you forget it while you're in the city. That implies that if you are in the city and you say, "I remember it," then it shouldn't be shikha. Lo avi shikha. So how do you reconcile the Braita? Ella, the Braita is telling you actually something very complicated, which of course is going to be very relevant for our Gemara. Lav hachika amar. This is what the Braita is teaching us. That bis sadeh, if you are still in the field, meaning you're still in the process of harvesting, then shachuach meikaro havishikha, then things that you forgot from the beginning, meaning you never remembered it, you totally forgot that you had, put up 4 bundles behind the driveway. Then, and you finish your harvest, havishikha. That's considered to be shikha. You got to leave it for the ani. If 5 days later you remember it, it's too bad. But if you're zachor ulebesof shachuach, but if first you remember, right? Say, oh, I remember that there are 5 sheaves behind, 5 bundles behind the garage. I don't want to forget them, right? We do this all the time. You try to remind yourself not to forget, and then you forget, of course, right? So you say to yourself, I want those, I don't intend to leave those. And then you harvest your whole field, and you come out the end of the day, and you say, okay, I'm done, right? Meaning, ubesof shachuach. In the end, you forgot. Then, ein shikha. Then that's not considered shikha because you basically said in the beginning, I don't intend to forget these things. I don't want to leave them. But says the Gemara, my time, why is that not shikha? Because since you're still there, since you're still in the field, the fact that you forgot them doesn't matter because you're still there and you can get them back. The kivan dekoi gaba, since you are standing there, meaning you're standing in your field, havile chatzero, at that point, it is your chatzer, because you own your field, right? And because you say, I want to acquire these things, zachtale, you basically were kona them without touching them, without lifting them, because you're standing there in the field.
It shouldn't make any difference, though, whether you're in the field or whether you're at your next door neighbors or down in the city. If you have this intent in your mind, it should work either way.
So there's the next words of the Gemara, aval be'ir, but the limud, the teaching of this Braita is that if you're in the city, meaning you're not at the field, Then if you're zachor l'bsov shachuach, if you basically say, I want these sheaves these bundles, I actually want to acquire them, but then you forget to actually pick them up when you're harvesting, and your harvest is done, and these bundles are still standing there. Havi shikha. In fact, it does matter, and it is shikha. And my time. Why is that any different? Why is it different if you're standing in your field or you're standing in your office in the city? Deleta gabe deliskile. You see from here that if you're not there to be kona them, that your field cannot make a kinyan for you because although it's your chatzer, no one disputes that. It's an open field, obviously, right? And since it's an open field, it's not mishtamer, it's not protected. And so your chatzer cannot be kona something for you if it's not protected. And so this is a whole new redefinition, right? We always thought chatzer was konab because it's like you're holding it, right? And Gemara's going to talk about this later. It's your hand. But what the Gemara is adding here from our Mishnah, potentially, is that it's not the case. A chatzer is your hand if it's an enclosed chatzer and it's protected. But a chatzer that's open, like a field, if you're not physically present, just saying this thing is in my field, I want to acquire it, it doesn't matter. And since you initially basically forgot it, it would count as shikha. And that's what the limit from the Bright. It's a very complicated limit, right? It said if you're in the city, well, it depends. If you're in the city and you originally remembered it, and then forgot it, you can't then recona it without going there in person.
Well, that would negate the whole concept of, let's say, a food drop, or if something fell from the sky in your yard, you then would say you couldn't acquire it.
100%. That's a very interesting contemporary thing to bring up, but yes. So that 100%, according to this, if something dropped into your yard, for example, and you were not there, even if you found out about it and you said, I want my yard to be, in loco of me, it doesn't matter. If it's not protected and you're not there, you cannot be kona, according to this opinion. Don't take this home yet. We're gonna, Gemara's gonna keep discussing this, but that is the way Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel explains our Mishnah. Now says Mimai. Now, how do you know that's how you read this pasuk? Because maybe, in fact, the pasuk's not telling you this complicated case that if you forgot it and then you remembered it, it depends on whether you're next to the field or you're not next to the field. Dilma, maybe there's a gzerat katufi. Maybe the pasuk's telling you something very straightforward. That if you're in the field and you forget something, then that's considered to be forgetting it. But if you're not even there and you have workers, that's presumably what we think we're talking about, that you have workers who are doing it and you're not there, then it's not considered shikha. Maybe it's a very limited, right, case of how you define what's forgotten, not something general about how you define the kinyan of a field. Says, well, that can't be the case because because the pasuk separately says about shikha later in Devarim, lo tashuv lekachto, that you shouldn't go back and pick it up. And that, what does it mean, go back? Obviously, it means a case where you're not there anymore. The Rabbot shikha ta'ir. It's telling you, even if you're not there, you left the harvest to your workers. Your idiot workers, let's say, didn't do the good job. And they came home and they said, we got 20 bundles. And you're like, there were 30 bundles there. Do you say, I'm going to go back and I'm going to get it? The pasuk says, lo tashuv lekachto. Once they finish the harvest, you can't go back if you're not there to get it. So obviously, it can't tell you that shikha only applies when you're in the field, not in the city, right? So, well, but that pasuk, hami by love. You need that pasuk for a lo taseh to say, don't go get it, right? The first pasuk only said you should do it on aseh. Well, imkain, nemakra lo tikachen. Torah could have always just said, don't take it. Why did it say lo tashuv? Don't go back. That's the Rabbot shikha. That's telling you that what you forget, and if you're in the city, you can't go back and get. So we know that the Torah can't be simply telling you shikha applies in the field and doesn't apply in the city. It must be telling you this very complicated case that if you remembered it and then forgot it, you can reacquire it only if you're in the field, not if you're in the city, because you have to be present in order for your sadeh to make a kinyan. Says, well, kati mi boile, before we finish sort of that proof, but kati mi boile, we still need this for another halacha of shikha, which Charlie obviously knows very well from the Mishnah and Peah. Like it's not, the Mishnah and Peah says a very interesting halacha, which is shelifanav ein shikha. If you are still harvesting the field and something is in front of you, right, even if you don't know about it. So obviously, if you see it, it's not shikha. But let's say you don't know about it. You look in front of you, in front of your field, and you think, the Gemara discusses, of course, how the parameters of this, but you look in front of you and you say, oh, I see there's 6 more bundles. Let me go grab those before lunch. And it turns out that over the hill, there's 10 more bundles that you don't even know about. But that's not considered shikha, because since it's in front of you, you're going to proceed along the field and you're going to see them. You're going to identify them. But shela acharav yesh shikha. But things that are behind you, right? That meaning you've already passed that area and you don't know about the thing. You don't have intention to go back and get it. That's considered to be shikha, shu bebal tashuv. You don't go backwards, is what shikha is. Zaklal, and that, in fact, the Mishnah in Peah says, Kol shehu bebal tashuv shikicha. Anything that you can't go back to, meaning that if you'd have to get it, you'd have to turn around to go back and get it, where you've already been, and you forgot it, that's considered shikicha. Kol she'eno bebal tashuv, anything that you don't need to go back to get, meaning it's in front of you, you just don't know about it yet, but you're walking across the field is going to identify it, that's eno shikha. Then that's not considered shikha. So the pasuk about tashuv is there to tell you that it has to be in front of you, not behind you. Amar Ravashi says, Ravashi, you're right, but there is actually another pasuk. Amar Kra Yihiyah. There's another pasuk that says Yihiyah, meaning you have to be present. It should be, not you have to be present. It should be, right? And Yihiyah always implies that it is in its state. And the way we understand that is the Rabot Shikha Ir. That in fact, if you forget something and you're in the city, it's also considered shikha, right? Now, so finally, so we are basically, despite all these limudim from Peah, which again is not exactly our sugya, the way we're understanding this braita of well, it's actually a braita that's unnamed, but the braita in Peah, about Peah, is that the pasuk is saying that if you wanted something and then you forgot it, and then you basically want to reacquire it with a kinyan, right? It only works if you are standing at the field, but if you're in the city, you cannot reacquire it. And this essentially, the Gemara is saying now, is a proof to the halacha of Yehuda Amar Shmuel, right? That a chatzer that's not mishtamer, a chatzer that's not watched, can only be kona for somebody if you're standing there so that you can potentially watch it. But if it's an open field, even though it's your field, the fact that either the animal will run away or someone else will come in and take it, means that you are not kona just because it's in your field.
Now, we had a discussion yesterday about the poel who works for a balabayit, whether the yad of the poel is considered the yad of the balabayit. And if you're saying here that he has workers there, why aren't the workers as like him, and everything that the workers are acting as a shikha, so therefore it could be that he could go back for it because the workers are there in his place, and they are essentially an extension of him.
It's a good question. I mean, the easiest, one simple answer is that maybe the workers left also, right? This might be happening after the fact. The workers were there. It could be they came to him in the city and said, "We're finished, our job, pay us." And he said to them, "How much did you harvest?" And the number they gave was much less than what he anticipated, right? That's the most likely case, actually. But a more complicated answer is that, what we talked about yesterday was that if the worker does something, it's as if the owner did it, right? They did it for the owner. But it's not necessarily the case that it goes the other way. That if the owner directs the worker essentially and says, "I want you to," without them knowing, right? That necessarily the worker can serve as an agent of the owner without knowing that that's the function they're doing, right? So they don't know that they're protecting this field unless he tells them, right? But and that might very well be the case, right? So I just want to be clear. When it says the owner is standing next to the field, it doesn't necessarily mean he personally is standing there. He could hire a watchman to stand next to the field, and that would make it a chatzera mishtamer, right? That would make it a field that's watched. But the problem is that here the workers don't necessarily know that that's the function they're supposed to be doing. So I think that, is a little more complicated answer. But of course, you can always say that they're not there. But it's a good point. But that is how we derive from this case. And says the Gemara, "V'chein Amar Ula," and furthermore, Ula is quoted. So remember, that was from Yehuda Amar Shmuel. But Ula was also quoted as explaining our Mishnah. V'husha omeid b'tzad sadeo. Our Mishnah only applies if you're standing next to your field. So again, there's a chicken hopping through the field. Everyone's chasing after it. You look out your window and say, "This is my field. I want the chicken." You're only kona if you're standing there and you could prevent it from leaving. So too Rabba Bar Chana said, this is only true if the person is standing next to their field. So that is the way the Gemara seems. Again, we're not done yet, but that's from this first page. It seems that there's very big consensus about that detail. Now, Rabbi Abba asked a question to Ula from a beautiful Mishnah. Also, we've had this Mishnah before. It's one of the fan favorites. It's this Mishnah, and it's a Mishnah in Masechet Maaser Sheni. The Mishnah has a very interesting case, right? Maaser b'Rabban Gamliel v'zkenim shayu ba'im basvina. It's a story, right? Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi, and many of the elders in the time of Rabban Gamliel, which I guess is the time right after the destruction of the temple, they were going in a boat. There's all kinds of different details to this incident. They were going to Rome. I forgot where it says, right? They were going in this boat, and they had to go in a rush, right? It wasn't something that they had a lot of time to plan. And in the boat, we're going to see in a second, is Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva, and there were other Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, sorry, Rabbi Akiva. There were many others. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan and Gudgida, right? The Rashi quotes here some of the Gemara in Erechin. Anyways, they're in the boat, and all of us, they had to rush to catch the last boat out of town, right? And Rabbi Gamliel realizes that he didn't remove maaser from some of the grain in his house. Right now, normally, this is how Rashi understands the whole Gemara, that it was talking about maaser. Maybe, he had grain in his house. He was afraid that he was going to be away, for 6 months in Rome. I don't know. People are going to be hungry. They're going to find grain. They're going to assume Rabban Gamliel is not going to leave grain that didn't take off maaser, and therefore we can eat it without taking off truma and maaser. He forgot to, or he didn't have a chance to yet. And therefore, he wanted to take off truma and maaser from the boat on things that were in his house in Yavne, right? So Rabbi Gamliel said the following: Isur shani atid lamud. When I get back home in 6 months, I'm going to take off 10%. I'm going to give it to a Levi, right? But I want to do it right now so that the rest of the grain can be eaten, right? So said Rabbi Gamliel, the 10th that I'm going to measure out in the future, natun li Yoshua. I want to give that over to Yehoshua. Let's assume Yeshua was a Levi. We're going to go with that. Umikomo muskarlo. Now, how does Rabbi Yeshua acquire that? Rabbi Yeshua standing next to him on the boat, by the way, right? So how does Rabbi Yeshua get that grain? So the place where that grain is sitting, I will rent to him so that he owns the plot, and the grain on that plot will be acquired by him by a chatzer, right? Now, just to point out, Tosfos points out here, right, that of course, the reason it's considered to be a chatzer she'ino mishtamer, it's a chatzer, it's not protected, even though it might have been in Rabbi Gamliel's, granary, is because within the granary there's a lot of space. He was giving him a very small area that's not designated, right? It was not protected on its own. So he basically said, I'm gonna rent him for 50 cents that land, and all the grain in that land is going to be his to be either he's the Levi or give it to the Levian, but it's going to be his, or a Kohen actually. Anyways, that's him. The Isur Acher Shani Atid Lamud. Remember, you have to give a second tenth for Maser Ani, right? Let's say it was a Maser Ani year. I am going to give that other tenth of the grain to Akiva ben Yosef, to Rabbi Akiva, who's standing on the boat with me. And Rabbi Akiva he was poor, but Rashi see that he was the Gabai, right? He was in charge of passing it out. So giving it to him dismisses your obligation to give it to charity, which is a very interesting detail as well, right? When you give charity, it's when you give it to the messenger, not necessarily to the poor person. So I want to give that to Akiva ben Yosef, so he'll give it to the poor people. Umikomo muskarlo, in the place, the chatzer, the little plot of land, maybe it's not so little, right? The 20-foot by 20-foot area where this grain is will be rented to him so that he owns the chatzer. He acquires the grain. I've now discharged my obligation of giving maaser and giving maaser ani, and now my family can eat the rest of the grain. Now, that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara. But
Rabbi Steinsaltz confirms that Rabbi Yehoshua was indeed a Levi, and in fact, he'd actually been one of the singers in the Beit HaMikdash.
Right, excellent. Thank you. Tosfos gets into this whole question about whether we actually give maaser to Leviim. Remember, Ezra made a knas and said it should only go to the Kohanim. But anyways, says the Gemara on the third line. How does this work though? If you claim that in order for a chatzer to work, you have to be standing there, how could Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Akiva acquire the grain and therefore fulfill his obligation of maaser? They weren't there. They were on the boat with him, right? Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, but they weren't standing next to the field. They were on the trip. That was part of the whole trip. So he asked this question to Ula. This Mishnah in Maaser Sheni is a fatal flaw to your theory that you have to be standing next to your field for your field to work. So Amar Le, so he answered him in a way that sometimes people answer, sometimes with cause and sometimes without. Said Ula to Rabbi Abba, maybe he didn't even say it to him. He said, Dami hai mirabanan kidlo gamiri in Chishmaita. This rabbi, this person who asked this question seems like someone who has not finished school yet, right? He doesn't seem like someone who knows how to learn. This is a nonsensical question. So he didn't even bother to answer him. So that was the response that of course the Gemara is going to get into this, don't worry. That was the response that Ula said to Rabbi Abba. Now, Ki'ata l'Sura, when Rabbi Abba didn't like that response, so he went to Sura, which I guess was the next yeshiva down the road. Amarlu, so he told over the whole story, right? He said, Achi Amar Ula. Ula told us this great psak that in order to be kona with the chatzer, you have to be standing there. V'achi otvite, and I remembered that great Mishnah from Maaser Sheni, and I asked him a question, and he didn't tell me anything. So I think, he was totally defending himself. Amar le'ahu merabanan. So one unnamed person in the Beit Midrash said, he was right. Because obviously Rabbi Gamliel mitaltli agav mekarkai hiknelahem. Rabbi Gamliel gave them the land, right? He gave them the land to acquire. And once meaning he said you can have land, I'm either given them or he rented them land within his house, right, within his field. And once you give someone land, you can give them mitaltlim not through a kinyan chatzer, that you own it because it's on the land. It's called basically kinyan agav, right? Remember, once you're giving someone land, you can agav give them mitaltlim with the same action. So in the process of selling them the land, which they paid him a little bit for, the same action can acquire the mitaltlim, and you don't need a kinyan chatzer. So you don't need to be there. And therefore, that's how Rabbi Gamliel gave it to them. And that's why Ula didn't even answer you. Rabbi Zera Kiblan, or Rabbi Zera in the Beit Midrash in Surah said, that's a great explanation. The student should get a gold sticker. And Rabbi Abba lo Kibla, but Rabbi Abba, who was, remember, the one asking the question, said, I'm still not satisfied, right? I don't think that's a good explanation. We'll see why. Amar Rava. Now, Rava said, I know everyone's being harsh on Rabbi Abba today, but Shaper Avid lo Kibla. Rabbi Abba was right. That is not a good explanation. Because what? Look, if you're claiming that the way Rabbi Gamliel gave them the land, the grain, was agav the karka, why couldn't he have just made what's called a kinyan sudar, right? If you can do agav, remember the way we used to, I say we used to because we don't do it so much anymore. Remember, if you used to remember selling your chametz to the Rav, right, or making him a kinyan, you would give a handkerchief over, and that would be kinyan chalipin, right? So you don't even need money for kinyan chalipin because you give the object back at the end, right? So if they were willing to make a kinyan agav, which is the same as a kinyan chalipin, where you basically are not giving money in exchange, you're just adding it on, or you're doing it sort of in that way, why couldn't they? Did they have a scarf or a something, a sudar, right, to do a chalipin? It must be there's a reason Rabbi Akiva didn't want to use a kinyan chalipin. Why did Rabbi Akiva not want to use a kinyan chalipin or a kinyan agav? It's because, remember, when you give this grain, let's be clear, you give the grain, let's say to Rabbi Akiva, or even let's say to Rabbi Akiva, right? You're giving the grain to Rabbi Akiva to give out to the aniyim. What did you actually give Rabbi Akiva? What did he get out of the transaction, right?
Nothing.
He doesn't get anything. And the same thing is true, right? Well, let me put it the other way. It's not just it's not what did Rabbi Akiva get? It's what did Rabbi Gamliel give? Right? Meaning, what does Rabbi Gamliel own in this grain? That's the bigger question. I misspoke. Rabbi Gamliel doesn't own this grain. He's got to give it away, right? And the same thing is true about Maaser. He doesn't own the Maaser. So when he gives over the Maaser, he's not actually giving anything of value to himself, to Rabbi Yeshua. That's how you would think about it. The reality is, though, there is a little bit of value in giving Maaser and in giving Ani because you get to direct where it goes, right? You get to decide, and everyone knows that. If someone gives you $1,000 to give away, you have some value there because you can engender goodwill and make decisions about where you give it to, right? The same thing, of course, is true about Maaser and Truma as well, where you can direct your Truma, your Maaser, to someone, and that's called Tovat Hana'ah. Tovat Hana'ah literally means a favor, right? Owed a favor, right? Someone, the benefit of the Hana'ah of knowing you can give it to. So basically, all that Rabbi Gamliel has in this thing, in this Maaser, is the value, which is a small amount of value, that he can engender goodwill by giving it to whoever he wants to give it to. By giving it over to Rabbi Yeshua, he gave over that right. So the thing is, says Rava, tovat hana'a eno mamon. That's not considered to be a tangible thing. It's considered to be essentially not a measurable amount of money. Liknot mimeno b'chalipin. And therefore, you can't use chalipin. Chalipin can only be done in something that's actual money, not something that, I wouldn't say it's symbolic, but it's a transfer of ownership that's not money. And so hachanami, it's very conceivable that tovat hana eno maman liknot al gabi karka. You couldn't give over the grain through the karka because all you're giving over is not the value of the grain, right? It's the benefit of being the one who's allowed to pass out this grain as maaser. And that's not considered to be tangible money. And therefore, you can't use these kinyanim, kinyan agav, and the other kinyanim of agav karka, of chalipin, to pass it over. The only kinyan you could use is a kinyan chatzer. And therefore, if the only kinyan you can use is a kinyan chatzer, this seems to prove that you don't need to be standing next to your chatzer. So Rava seemed to agree with Rabbi Abba. Says the Gemara, and this is the final line, belohi, but that's incorrect. Rava is wrong, and therefore Rabbi Abba is wrong. Because matnot kuhuna netinak tivbo. When it says matnot kuhuna, it says give it over, right? Natan. So even though it's true that it's not yours to give over, the fact that the Torah uses the word netina means that we give you an aspect of ownership over, and therefore chalipin, the kinyan of chalipin, which is where you pass over a sudar, right, a scarf, derech mekach umemker, that's involved. That's considered to be a purchase, right, a business deal, not a giving. And you cannot use chalipin for maaser. But mitaltalin agav karka, when you're giving objects that are movable, right, mitaltalin, through karka, that is nitina alimptahi, that would be considered to be a strong form of giving, and therefore, in fact, you could pass over the tovat hana'a agav the karka. And therefore, according to this, right, the reason that Rabbi Gamliel was able to give over the objects, the grain, the maaser, to Rabbi Yoshua and to Rabbi Akiva is because he gave it agav the karka. So he basically rented them the karka, in which case the money or some kinyan transacted for the money for the land. He sold them the land, and agav them acquiring the land, they can acquire the things that are on the land, even not through a kinyan chatzer, but through a kinyan of mitaltalin agav karka. And so, according to where we stand now, in fact, Ula is right, and you cannot make a kinyan chatzer unless you're there. If it's a chatzer that's not mishtamer. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yoshua acquired this because they were getting the land as well. So that
but is sell it or they rent it. There's a difference.
There's not a difference in terms of kinyan. It's the same thing because owning it for a period of time is owning it completely. So it doesn't matter for a kinyan whether you rented it with money or you sold it forever.
And then if he did so, okay, if you say there's no difference and he sold it or rented it to somebody else, then it's not his anymore. Then doesn't Rabbi Yeshua now have the obligation to give Meiser if it's his and not Rabbi whoever?
No, let me be clear. He didn't sell the grain, right? He sold the land and he gave him the grain agav the land. So he didn't sell him the land and everything on it. That's not what he did. He sold him the property. But in the transfer of the property, you can add on, you can say with the process, whatever, I'm not sure how you think about it, with the process of you becoming the owner or temporary owner of this land, you also acquire all this grain to be that which is maaser. So he's as maaser, he didn't give it to them. So he wasn't giving them the grain as an ownership. He was giving them the grain as maaser. They now, of course, have to do whatever they do with it. That's one answer. Rav Papa says, I got a whole new answer. And the difference in the case of our Mishnah, where Ula said, if everyone's chasing after a deer, it's running through your backyard, it's got a broken leg, right? They're chasing after the deer, and you say, I want the deer for myself, you have to be there. And in the case of Rabbi Gamliel, where Rabbi Gamliel gave them over the grain and said, you can have this grain because I'm giving you land to be a chatzer, and I'm giving you the grain to be maaser, they didn't have to be there. What's the difference? Says Rav Papa, dat acheret makne otan sha'ani. The difference is that there's another person giving it to them, right? In the case of the Metzia, there's no other party. This is a hefker animal. It's running around. If you want to acquire the animal, you have to be there. But if someone else, like in this case, Rabbi Gamliel says, I want to give you this thing, that other person's intent to give it to you is more powerful, and it makes you able to acquire it even if you're not there. Uminat timra. Now, how do you know that from our Mishnah? It's not, because look, our Mishnah said the following. It said, Ra'a otan ratzin achar ha-metzia. You see a bunch of people running after a Metzia, and you say, I want it, you get it. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. I guess I wouldn't say how you know it, but it's stated. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah, named Rabbi Yochanan, the only time that you can say, these people are chasing after a chicken, right, in your yard, and they're all trying to get it, and you say, it's my yard, I want it. If you're there, it's yours. Says Rabbi Yirmiyah, it's not always yours. It's only sheratzach magian. It's only if you catch up to it before it runs out of your field, right? By Rabbi Yirmiyah, so meaning if you don't catch up to it, then it is not yours. You have to actually achieve it. You get it. You just get it ahead of other people. And asked Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Yochanan, b'matana heich. What if it was a gift? Meaning, what if someone actually said to you, I want to give it to you, and meaning someone has an animal, they want to give it to you, and it's running through your field, can you acquire it if you don't catch up to it, right? So Kabla Minei, Rabbi Abba Bar Kana, Rabbi Kana said to them, even if you run after it and you don't capture it, meaning someone says to you, look, I don't want my deer anymore, I want to give it to you, and it's in your field, and you say, okay, I want my field to be Kona Ed, but then you chase after it and it escapes from your field before you get it, and now it's in somebody else's field. Is it yours or not yours? Said Rabbi Abba Bar Kana, it's yours, even though you didn't capture it while it was in your field. Now, my time, why is there a difference between a Metzia and a matana? It must be because this really matters. Lav mishum de dat acheret makneot shani. Someone else is giving it to you as a gift. Their intent is they want to give you this deer, right? And so therefore, it's enough for you to say, I want it in my field, even if you can't capture it yet. But if it's what's it called? A gift, lost object, lost my word there, but if it's a aveda, right, and it's something that you're just finding, then you need to actually be able to capture it in your field. So that is a proof that up to this halacha of Papa, that in fact it matters whether Rabbi Gamliel is giving it to them or not. I'm really Rav Shimi Rav Papa, said Rav Shimi to Rav Papa, I got a problem with that from the case of get. Where are we? We're 7 lines on the bottom. What about the case of get? Think about a get, right? In a get, of course, the husband or the soon-to-be ex-husband is always giving over a get. Dat acheret makneota, right? Here, the person is intending to give it to her. Now, Ula said before that the only time, we didn't have this Ula yet, but the only time that a man who throws a get to his soon-to-be ex-wife and it lands in her field, that in her chutzner, that she is kona and she's divorced, is only if she's there. Hu she'omedet b'tzad beita or b'tzad chatzera. It's only if she's standing next to her house or next to her chatzer. Now, what? Remember, this is consistent with Ula, who says that a chatzer is only kona if you're there. But if you just said there's an exception when someone else is giving it to you, why don't you say by a get that someone else is giving it to you? And so if someone else is giving it to you, you don't need to be there. Enters the Gemara, Shani get ita bal karche. Get's different because get can be given against her will. That's where, well, that makes it even a bigger question, right? Because if it can be given against her will, it means that the person giving it has even more power. Then it should certainly be something that can be given to her with more power without her being there. Ma get itabal karcha. By a get, it can be given against her will if it's given physically to her, but still Ula said in ilolo. Right? Only if she's standing next to the field does the field acquire it for her, but if she's not, it doesn't. So matana dimidate lo kol shekain. So certainly by a gift, where you can only give a gift from a person who wants to accept the gift, certainly you shouldn't have to be standing, have to be standing next to your field, right? So the answer does not make any sense if you look at the case of get. Ella Amar Ravashi, and this sort of brings together a whole sugya from yesterday, the last words of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Bet, and turn the page, or it's not a page, but turn over. Says Ravashi, in fact, you have to go back to the original discussion about how a chatzer is koneh. Is it a shliach or is it a yad? Because says Ravashi, chatzer itrabi mishum yad. A chatzer is included for a woman who's getting a divorce. Her chatzer counts as her hand, right? Because you have to give it in her hand. We say putting in her chatzer is as if you gave it to her hand. But lo gar'am mishlichut, but it doesn't reduce the element of the fact that the chatzer is also working as a shliach, which is fascinating. But yesterday we thought it was one or the other, and now we're saying that at least by get, which is a unique case, a chatzer is both her hand and her messenger. And gabi get dechov hula, right? A get is considered to be a negative for a person, even though, of course, many people get a get or are happy to get it. But in general, when you're looking at a monetary way, she's losing her protection, losing her support. So a get is considered to be a financially negative thing. Ein chavin la'adam ela b'fanav. And the responsibility thing is you can't be a shliach to do something negative for someone unless they're there, right? So therefore, by a get specifically, the woman has to be standing next to the chatzer. But gabi matana, when you're talking about a gift that you're giving, or either a gift or maybe in the case of an aveda, dizchutulo, it's just pure benefit, right? There's no negative in this. And then zachin la'adam shlo b'fanav. There, a chatzer can work even if they're not there. So it turns out you basically have three cases, right? A get is a unique case because a get is, or anything else that's considered to be a lien, basically, a responsibility. Maybe you throw a subpoena to someone, right? Or whatever, summons. That's considered to be a negative. And if you just put in their chatzer and they're not standing there, that's not considered to be enough because the chatzer works partially as a shliach, and you can't have a shliach for something that's negative unless they know about it, right? So that's by a get. By a matana, where someone else is giving it to you, it can be acquired by your chatzer even if you're not there, right? You have to want to acquire it, or it's assumed you want it, but you don't have to be standing there. But if it's an aveda, if it's a metzia, a thing that's object that is found, there, since no one is actively giving it to you, it's basically hefker. Everybody has equal rights to it. Then, if you want to have your field acquire that, it's not enough to say, oh, it's in my field, I want my field to acquire it. You actually have to be standing there and make it mishtamer. You have to be chatzer and mishtamer and be standing there in order for your chatzer to be acquire it. And as we saw from Ula, it also means that you have to be able to actually get it, right? If it's going to run out of your field before you can get it, then you cannot acquire it. So therefore, we have basically three different levels. Get, which is its own case, and then things that are given to you by someone else, which is a lot easier to acquire, and things that you basically are acquiring from Hefker, which you have to have more input and more presence in order to acquire them. That's the end of today's daf. We will start tomorrow from Gufa, and obviously get back to many details of our Mishnah. Chodesh Tov, everyone.
Kodesh Tov, Yasher Koab.
Thank
Fascinating daf.
Oh, wait, yes, I have one more thing to say, which I'll put in the WhatsApp. So our tradition has been, and I think we have to continue it for many reasons, is that once we change the clock, we start learning in person on Shabbat, because Motzei Shabbat is too late. Unfortunately, we lose Robert those Saturday nights, but we've been doing it in person an hour before Mincha at HIR. How does that work?
Generally it works, but this week we're out of town, so we'll miss this week.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to work.
Well, one second. So if it's not going to work for the majority of people, we should revisit that. I mean, it doesn't work.
Yeah, this weekend is not going to work for us no matter what. So just do whatever works for everybody else.
So Ken, what works for you?
It would be better on Zoom. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, but it's going to be very late, though. You can handle very late.
You have to do what's best for the people of Riverdale, but for those of us not in Riverdale, it's obviously best to do it on Zoom.
Wait, so Robert, you can do Zoom late Saturday night? It wouldn't be too late for you, like 9 o'clock or something? 8:30?
For me, in general, that would be fine.
In general, that works for me, just not this week.
Right, I'm not opposed. I don't mind either way. I think we've done it traditionally, but if our crowd is different, we should adopt to the crowd. So let's talk about it some more. I'm totally okay with that, and maybe this week we'll do late and see how it goes. But I would say Perm's going to be in 2 weeks, so that's going to be a little challenging. But we'll deal with 1 week at a time. Okay, everyone.
Yasher Koab, Kodesh Tov.
Kodesh Tov, Shavua Tov.
Good morning. It's early, isn't it? It's early, isn't it? Just saying good morning. It's early, right? You still tired? Still tired, right? All right? Okay, you're still tired, right? Okay. I'm going out for a little while.